You picture the Philippines as beaches and jeepneys and colonial churches. You picture history starting the day a Spanish ship showed up. But the real answer is far stranger. Centuries before that ship arrived, your ancestors were running one of the busiest trading networks in the ancient world. Gold moved through these islands. Porcelain moved through these islands. Kingdoms rose from the profits. Almost none of it made your textbook. Why would a small river settlement in Mindanao need 9 wooden boats buried in its soil? In 1976, workers near the Agusan River in Butuan hit wood. Not driftwood, a hull. Archaeologists pulled up plank-built vessels called balangay, some over 15 meters long, dated as early as the 4th century. That's centuries before Europe had heard the word Philippines. These were sewn plank ocean ships, built without a single nail, flexible enough to survive open water. Archaeologist Eusebio Dizon, who led the excavations for the National Museum, showed this was no isolated fishing village. Butuan was a port, with shipwrights, with sailors who timed monsoons well enough to cross open sea on schedule. Trace the coast north and you reach Tondo, at the mouth of the Pasig River. Chinese records from the Song and Ming dynasties mention trade missions from the islands they called Ma Yi. Tondo controlled river access to the interior, meaning it controlled the flow of goods. Not a fishing village. A customs house with a throne. Go south and the Sulu Sultanate, established by the 15th century, sat where routes from China, the Malay world, and the Spice Islands crossed. Sulu traders dealt in pearls, tortoiseshell, birds' nests, the deep-sea goods Chinese merchants paid fortunes for. So why don't you know this? Historian William Henry Scott spent decades trying to reconstruct pre-colonial life using sources not written by the colonizers. He called it the problem of pre-Hispanic evidence, because most of what survives was filtered through missionaries writing a century after conquest, describing a culture already reshaped. What he found underneath wasn't primitive, it was intricate. Anthropologist Laura Lee Junker took it further. Her research on Philippine chiefdoms describes a political economy built on prestige goods, gold, Chinese porcelain, beads. Chiefs held power not just through land, but through controlling trade goods and redistributing them through feasting and alliance. A chief who could produce enough imported porcelain to honor a coastal community wasn't just wealthy, he was legitimate. The gold sashes and death masks pulled from graves near Butuan and Surigao weren't isolated treasures. They were the visible remains of a system where a datu could outrank a rival not through army size but through the depth of his trade connections. Chinese blue and white porcelain, some dated to the Yuan dynasty, shows up in burial sites across the islands, arriving long before any European ship. In exchange, the islands exported gold, wax, pearls, civet, birds' nests so prized in Chinese cuisine that trade relationships were built around them. Here's the twist. When Magellan's expedition reached these waters in 1521, they weren't stumbling onto an untouched frontier. They were arriving late to a network already running for over 1,000 years. Antonio Pigafetta, the chronicler who survived that voyage, described local rulers dressed in gold, presiding with a confidence that only comes from generations of established wealth. The Spanish didn't discover the Philippines. They plugged into a system Chinese, Arab, Indian, and Malay merchants had used for centuries. Why does the story you were taught start with a ship instead of a network? Because conquest needs a blank page. It's easier to justify colonizing a place with no prior history than one already running its own economy. The blank page wasn't true. It was useful. And useful stories survive longer than true ones, especially when the tellers control the record. New balangay excavations keep surfacing. New porcelain shards keep coming out of the ground. Every dig adds another line to a story nearly erased entirely. You live in a world built by trade routes you can't see. You assume global interconnection is a modern invention. It isn't. Your ancestors were plugged into networks like this long before anyone called it globalization. The Philippines was never on the edge of history, waiting to be found. It was in the middle of it, trading gold for porcelain, hosting fleets from 3 empires, deciding who ruled through the depth of a chief's connections rather than the size of his sword. You just weren't told that part. You picture the Philippines as beaches and jeepneys and colonial churches. Now you know the truth underneath that picture. Islands that were never waiting to be discovered, they were already the destination.